Guys, you've reached the Crazy Monkey New Mexico podcast with your host, Nathan Wagar. Today, we're going to be talking about something that is near and dear to my heart. It's the program that I created for the Crazy Monkey Defense self-defense programs, specifically, at this point in time, Combat Intelligent Athlete. And the program I developed is called TARMAC. I've been referencing it pretty frequently in the other podcasts. I'll continue to do so in the future. But what I'm going to do is just kind of give you a rough outline without digging too deeply into it because there's plenty of material to cover and kind of give you a deeper insight into my approach to this. So TARMAC stands for Threat Assessment and Response Matrix for Aggression Control. And don't get too hung up in the buzzwords because honestly, as a prior military guy, I have a penchant for cool acronyms. It's got to make a good t-shirt. And the original one was Threat Assessment and Response Program. And I told my buddy, my mentor, Eric Colasar, I was like, hey, check this out. I was like, Threat Assessment and Response Program. And he's like, TARP? You're going to call it TARP? And I was like, touche. So he actually named it TARMAC. He's like, how about TARMAC? I was like, oh, that sounds cool. But I was like, but the words don't fit. So he's like, well, then you better find words to do. And so that's what we did. We we found ourselves in the unique situation of basically finding longer words to justify having the cooler acronym. But, I mean, if you know anything about military guys, yeah, we have kind of a love-hate thing with acronyms. We don't want to sound too tactical because then it's kind of retarded, but at the same time, it's got to make a good t-shirt. So TARMAC is what it's called, and that is the story behind the name. TARMAC actually, it's kind of funny. In the military world, TARMAC is the name of this road construction used on like landing pads and stuff. So I was telling my buddy, I was like, TARMAC, where the rubber meets the road in reality-based self-defense. He's all, no. So, anyway, TARMAC is basically the entire context, the bird's eye view of an assault or altercation in everyday life, from beginning to end. It's a 3-step process, okay? So first what we do is we teach you safety patterns because a lot of people don't even know what actually constitutes a threat or what doesn't constitute a threat. So you have some people that don't worry enough and you have other people that they worry too much. So we teach you safety patterns, ways to conduct and carry yourself in everyday life. And then step 1 is wherever you go, you are going to basically give yourself a risk assessment for the environment that you're in. And we have what's called a low threat environment, which is probably where you spend most of your time in your day-to-day life, your house, your job, well-lit public areas like Walmart, although that might not be the safest place in the world. Then we have what's called kind of low threat environment but high threat locations. These are locations that maybe have lots of dead space, they violate your safety patterns that we taught you, or they're places where money changes hands. So in the parking lot outside of a store, an ATM machine, that's where you're likely to be the victim of financial crime. And then there's what we call a high threat environment. And a high threat environment is, a bad neighborhood, poverty-stricken area. That's where the environment itself is high threat, and you want to avoid that at all costs. Now, based off of your known safety patterns and step 1, where you determine the risk level of where you're at, you are going to do step 2, which is you're going to look for things that look out of place based off of the safety patterns we taught you. So now you know what safe is. We're going to teach you to basically pay closer attention to things that don't meet those safety patterns. People that get too close to you and they're strangers, there's a lot of things that you could be looking for. And that's kind of where people can get specific to the audience that they're teaching. But in the broad strokes, we teach you basic safety patterns that rely on personal space and maintaining distance, 360-degree awareness, and always go into a place and know where the exit is, because that's going to factor into step 3. So step 2, you're looking for these anomalies, these breaks and safety patterns, and if you see these breaks and safety patterns, you start to pay attention to that person, and that person can only be a threat at that point if he does both of 2 things. He makes consistent eye contact, whether intermittent or sustained, and he closes distance. That's it. That's all he can do. He has to do that to hurt you. So that's what we're looking for. And at that point, we move to step 3. Now, step 3 has a different driver, so to speak. Step 1 and 2, the safety pattern, what we call pre-threat movement, is what's driving steps 1 and 2. It's like you're taking corners wide, you're maintaining your distance, you're looking around consistently. These are all things that you're carrying yourself confidently with good posture, standing erect, because good posture can deselect you as a victim right off the bat. And once you determine something's a threat and you move to step 3, though, then we go into what's called zoning. And zoning is a movement technique where we move kind of tangentially off of the opponent or the threat and toward our predetermined escape. Because knowing our escape ahead of time is one of our safety patterns that we teach. Okay. And so the reason why we move tangentially is because at a distance, you're looking for weapon cues on that potential threat as you move toward your escape. And when you determine something is a threat, you're going to move into your escalation of force. And at the top of that is always to escape. Below that is de-escalate. So that's you let him get too close and now you need to de-escalate the situation. That's usually at about rim or slightly greater. The least desirable is to engage. And so you always want to work either higher up that ladder on the escalation of force, or we want to start that ladder as high up as possible so that we always get to our end goal, which is to leave the scene of the altercation. So let's put this into a kind of practical application. If I'm utilizing good safety patterns, I walk out of Walmart. I know that this is kind of a risky location at least because I'm going to a parking lot. There's lots of dead space. That's space that you can't see around corners and all that until you pass the line, so to speak. It's there's a place where money has changed hands, and so I walk out the door. I take the corners wide. I kind of check around the corners a little bit as I'm walking forward. I move around my car wide so I can spot anybody that's kind of hiding around vehicles or anything like that. And maybe I see somebody off in the distance and they keep making intermittent eye contact and then they gradually start walking closer to me. I don't know who he is, and this is a high threat location. And so at that point, I can kind of determine what I'm going to do. If I'm going to potentially teach him or treat him as a threat, I might get into my vehicle, or I might just go back into the store, which is probably a better option because sometimes getting into your vehicle is it's not the safest thing to do. You don't have the time to fumble with the keys and get inside and lock the door, turn the vehicle on, drive out, and that's how a carjacking can happen. So I might just walk back inside. That is determining that something's a threat. I see the eye contact and the closing in distance, so I'm going to treat him as a threat. I saw those anomalies in behavior, and I move toward my escalation of force. Now, the highest rung on the escalation of force is to escape. That's our overriding goal that everything else is kind of subservient to. So, if I hadn't been paying attention and he attacked me, once I get to the distance where I can use my bear stance and go back to de-escalation, I'm keeping my eyes on him. Why? In case the threat escalates, in case he displays a weapon cue and maybe pulls out a gun or a knife or something like that. So I'm moving tangentially. I do not just turn my back to him and go back into the store because then I can't see if the threat has increased. But I am always moving toward my overriding goal of escape. And zoning is the footwork technique that I use to do that. So I'm moving tangentially toward the escape, but away from the largest threat. And this applies to multiple opponents as well. So basically, you're minimizing the access that as many threats have to you as possible at any given time. So there's 3 ways to zone. One is you kind of line them up so they're not all facing you. They don't all have access to you at the same time. 2 is you maximize your distance from the nearest person. Or 3 is you use an obstacle to zone off of. So you might go around a corner, and then you only have to deal with one person as they come around the corner at a time. These are the 3 possible ways to zone. The largest threat is always the nearest threat or the threat with a projectile weapon, one or the other. So if you had multiple opponents, say there's 3 guys, one of them's closer, but the slightly further one has a gun, you're going to zone off the person with the gun. And you might use that near opponent to do your zoning off of as the obstacle. But the greatest threat is at that point the person with the projectile weapon. And so it's a very simple 3-step system. You know your safety patterns. You know the threat level that you're in of any given environment. You look for oddities, breaks in safety pattern that warrant your attention. You look for a close in distance and eye contact, and if you determine at that point that that person's a threat, you move to your escalation of force and try to escape as you zone. It's that simple. But it isn't that simple, because throughout this process, you have factors like the flinch response, pre-contact stuff like pre-assault cues, de-escalation. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. When are you looking for weapon cues versus when are you looking for assault cues? And which one is more important at which time? And are you doing the right thing at the right time? Because a lot of people, in a self-defense situation, it's so chaotic that you need a system that is going to cover universals in human behavior and attack styles. And the same for your technical skill set. And the reason why this is important is so that it has carryover. You only have a few things to worry about that everybody does. And so you can kind of, it's a concept known as, I call it the hourglass. Basically, I'm going to force certain options out of my opponent so that I know what he's going to do because he can only do certain things. So I'll give you an example. If I'm de-escalating and I'm in my bear stance, if I hold my hands too wide, he has hook and center lines available to me. If I hold my hands so that they occupy the center line, then he has to throw a hook line or he has to remove the barrier. And so in my training, I can basically not only force those 2 options, but train for just those 2 options because I know those are the 2 options that I gave him. Does that make sense? So funneling and the hourglass concept, basically it narrows what he can do, and in turn that narrows what I have to worry about. And in a chaotic situation like a fight or a physical assault, that's a really crucial thing. If you have too much to worry about, stuff is going to escape your notice, like weapons, accessing a knife, or something like that. So the threat might have increased, and you might not know it. That's why there's so many people where they get stabbed and they say, I never saw the knife. Now, is that to say that you won't see the knife? Well, it depends on how you train. And a lot of people say they train like this. I promise you they don't, because I have them at my training facility and I run them through it, and they're always making small mistakes. And it's those small mistakes that they think don't matter that does. And that's where TARMAC really shines. There's also, TARMAC is also unique in the fact that you are playing chess with the opponent or with a potential threat from the very beginning. So you are trying to nip this potential altercation in the bud as soon as possible so that you never end up in kind of the worst case scenario where you're using a late flinch response because you just got ambushed by your car. Because according to this method, that should theoretically never happen. unless you seriously violated some important steps in the system. Sorry about that. I had to get a sip of Pepsi. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, de-escalation techniques. So like verbal de-escalation techniques. A lot of people teach that. And I do too. And I'm not saying that it's not important. But here's the thing. A lion does not argue or negotiate with a lamb. And so if your potential aggressor has the drop on you, or he thinks he has the drop on you, what you say doesn't matter to him because he has his plan and he's going to execute it. Now, on the other hand, if from the very beginning you are posturing yourself in a way that puts his feet back on the parallel line every time he tries to blade off, you are staring at the weapon cues, so at his hands at the correct range. I mean, think about it. If you're the bad guy and you're trying to assault somebody by surprise, and every time you try to get yourself in an attack posture or reach for the weapon, he's already looking at you. Then it's a question of, well, is this worth it? So now you just leveled the playing field psychologically. Now you can work your de-escalation. Now he'll actually listen to what you have to say because the jig is up. And you're going to give him that out. And he is going to take it because it's not worth it for him. That's how it works. And these things are critical. TARMAC approaches all of this from beginning to end. Reading the situation, looking for only the things that can actually harm you at any given moment and worrying about them. So some people think that this kind of stuff in reality-based self-defense makes you worry more and it makes you paranoid. No, I would argue actually the exact opposite. It lets you worry less. And the things that you might not have thought were important before that actually are, it lets you recognize those things. So it gives you a more realistic appraisal of situations, and also lets you know when someone is bluster and when they're serious and he's a serious threat. And TARMAC covers all of that. And the escalation of force is based off of distance. So let's say that you get attacked and there is a break in that aggressive forward moment or motion, and the momentum is lost, so there's kind of a reset. At that point, this usually happens past rim, okay, because otherwise you'd still be hitting him or he'd still be attacking you. So at that point, based off of that distance, you need to go back to your bear stance, pardon me, and you need to go back to de-escalation. Why? Because if a witness were to walk in at that point, you're two mutual combatants, and you might end up in jail too. Okay, so anytime you get in that position where you're back to de-escalation, well, that's a higher rung on the ladder of the escalation of force. And what's the rule? We always want to travel up on that ladder. So at that point, we should already be zoning off to our escape. And so in a way, it's one of the most defensive systems because we always have that overriding goal. I never let someone set and fight in the drills, because TARMAC is very drill-oriented. You have to drill this stuff. I never let them set and fight when they could just keep moving, because that'll also get you caught up against multiple opponents. And so this is another thing that sets TARMAC apart is the drills. So I have these progressions of drills that I've developed that work you through all of the physical material of the Combat Intelligent Athlete program, but you're drilling in the TARMAC concepts like weapons cues, pre-assault cues, de-escalation, posture, and the drills work you against multiple opponents from the very beginning. What I don't endorse is teaching a lot of these concepts. You teach the physical stuff, and then all of a sudden you're like, all right, now let's do it all again live against multiples. It doesn't work like that. It's way too difficult. What this does is, so let's say I have a drill where you're zoning toward your escape, and you have one person, he's not allowed to do anything except walk into you. That's it. Just walk into you. Now, what's the purpose of that? Because when he gets close enough, you're going to fend him off with the bear stance, and then you're going to continue zoning. And then you might do that, except now he's allowed to display a weapon cue. And if you see the weapon cue, you do the proper movement technique. All right, now we're going to do that same drill, except it's 2 people and they can just walk into you. Cool, now we're going to do that same technique and it's 2 people and one of them can display a weapon cue. And then you have to zone off of the one person that's the greatest threat. It was normally the closest opponent, but now it's the one that's displaying the weapon. Okay? And that's a very basic drill. All they're allowed to do is walk into you, but you've already worked some pretty important concepts across the board. And then you can start adding stuff. And then you can start adding ranges, so you can allow actual contact. You can allow clinch. You could even start from the ground. But it's always the end goal of moving upward through the ladder of your escalation of force. And so that's TARMAC. This kind of barely just scratches the surface of it. But, in one sense, it's very, very simple. It's 3 steps. And in another sense, it can get very, very deep. And it also depends on how deep you want to get into a physical curriculum. But it's also able to be taught, modularly within a seminar format or within a several-day course. It would be on you. And that's kind of how I approach it. The money is in the drills, though. The drill progressions, TARMAC cannot just be something studied in a class. You need to do it. You need to drill it, and I think you will, I promise you. I mean, it saved my life, so it'll save yours too. Well, that is all. I've got some pot stickers I got to finish, so if you have any questions, feel free to email me, nathanwagar@yahoo.com, or you can call me 505-385-0224. And I can also be reached at my YouTube channel. Just Google YouTube Nathan Wagar and check out my channel there. There's some videos there that maybe won't be seen on the podcast. So, try to subscribe to both if you can. And until then, stay safe.